This is ARPL519, Survey of American Architecture, 1600 to 1850. This class is offered through the School of Architecture and Planning at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. My name is Dr. Christina Wilson, and I am your instructor for this class. This is a bold slide because it says architecture in the United States. This is the first time that we have actually seen the mention in black and white of the United States. We have been building up to this literally for half the semester. And from here on in, we are going to be talking about architects who practiced literally at the dawn of the United States of America, at the beginning of a new nation. And the first architect we're going to meet today is Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Very interesting architect, as you'll see. Before we do that, though, I just want to set the stage. We want to back up a little bit and put things in my favorite C word. We want to put things in historical context. And I am showing you a map of the 13 colonies. And this area shows us the land on the eastern seaboard and into slightly inland in North America, the land that was controlled by the British at the outbreak of the American Revolution. And, you know, there are historians, believe it or not, that don't do anything but focus on military history, naval history, history of war and battlements. You know, you think if you played Battleship or Risk as a kid, imagine doing that as a full-time job. That's kind of what military and naval and those sorts of historians do. It's all about the battles and the tactics and all this sort of stuff. And I could literally, if you wanted me to, I see a couple of you yawning as I'm talking about this. How interesting. You do not want me to talk about the battlement strategies of the American Revolution. Well, I could do it, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to mention it briefly. This map shows you, look at this. We've got British victories, American victories. Remember, the American Revolution lasted for almost 6 years. It was a big deal. It took a long time. And you can see there are battles along here, and there are quite a few British victories. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. It takes a while for the American Revolution to play out. It's very easy for us to look at images like this sort of heroic idea of the Americans marching in, and they are, you know, declaring their freedom and their autonomy from the British, and it's all very hunky-dory. But, you know, the whole history of the war itself is very complex indeed. And it does take place over 6 years, as I mentioned, 1775 to 1781. There are lots of battles. There are lots of tactics and strategies. There's a lot of back and forth. This is the way wartime is. And something that you're going to hear me say in class all the time, there's always a complete stop to architectural production during wars. Always. Because the effort of a nation or colonies or a political entity fighting against another entity, in this case, the American colonies fighting against England, all of their political, economic, monetary efforts and all manpower goes toward fighting the war. And so that all of that energy and effort is so focused on the objective of winning the war that there's no room at all for any sort of architectural output. And there's no need for it because the focus is the war itself. And so you're going to see that all of the manpower and all of the effort and all the money, and remember, Americans borrow a lot of money from the French to capitalize and finance this operation. The entire focus is on winning the war and securing this objective of breaking free from England, the mother country, the British government, in an effort to create this new entity, which will become the United States. This is not an easy thing. And, you know, we tend to think of it, oh, here's the 4th of July, we wrote the Declaration of Independence, ta-da! You know, we have fireworks and fried chicken, and it's great. It's really much more complicated than that. And all you have to do is look at a map and just look at these dates, and you can see. Now, remember, and this is all war that's fought on the water. It's naval. And then the battles are fought on land, either on horseback, and most of the military regiments, most of the soldiers are on foot marching around. They're not in vehicles because there aren't any. And most soldiers wouldn't have even had horses. They would have been on foot marching these tremendous miles. And there were a lot of people that died, of course. It was a very serious effort. We know mostly about the sort of play-by-play about the revolution and how it plays out and how the various colonies reacted to what was happening from newspapers. There were plenty of newspapers throughout the American colonies, and there's a tremendous amount of reporting. And there's a very long and very interesting history of journalists literally being out in the field during wartime, reporting and sending information about the front, the battlefront, back, so people know what's going on. Bloody news, there's documentation of the tremendous loss of life. And of course, battles are won and lost on both sides. And it's quite a tug of war, and it takes a long time for this to all play out. When you look at images like this from the 18th century, it kind of has this Currier and Ives. It looks kind of quaint. We don't have photography. We don't have a way to document it in real time. I mean, there's something very powerful, and there's also something very horrifying about how these days we have policemen with body cameras and we can see the horrific things that are happening in real time. That is a very recent phenomenon, frankly. The only way that people would know what was happening are through artistic renderings like this, or the written word in newspapers, or this whole notion of cartoons. And it's a different kind of historical evidence, and it's a different way of conveying information. And remember, even a journalist reporting from the front or the battlefield is reporting and talking about what's happening from his particular point of view. So there's already a filter, because you're not standing there, and obviously there isn't a camera phone capturing all of this. You all are so used to Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all this stuff that shows you everything in every second of every day, and you have multiple devices and you have multiple screens and you're looking at everything. You want to talk about sensory overload. That is not the case at all. And it's very important to keep that in mind, because there's a sort of a lag, if you will, from the time something happens on the battlefield or out there in, on the front, and the people back at home learning about what's happening. And so there's a delay of information, and that's part of the reason the war takes 6 years. There are other ways that we can interpret people's perceptions and ideas about what's happening. This is the Liberty Song. In freedom we're born. I am not going to sing it for you today. But it is, there are all sorts of songs and poems and all sorts of creative endeavors that interpret what's happening in terms of wartime and the attitude towards it and all of this sort of stuff. Remember that most of the images that we have, that we take for granted as a given, these are images that were created either during the time or long after. I think that these both are 19th century images. And here we have George Washington. He's on a white horse, literally. He's victorious. Everybody, looks very tidy. Notice how all the Americans are standing up and the British are dead. It's not quite, I'm not sure it was quite that simple. But, again, there's this artistic license and this sense of interpreting what was happening and then conveying it in some sort of artistic and meaningful way. But this is after the fact. So this is kind of a filter. These images are between what happened and us. And so we always have to think about that in terms of the artistic license that is taken, showing George Washington in his very tidy outfit on a white horse in this beautifully composed rendering. Washington taking command of the American army. I mean, everybody's wearing white pants, really, it really underscores this heroic enthusiasm that this new nation has about the founding fathers and the war heroes that are responsible for this victory. And I also mention this because remember that in the 19th and well into the 20th century, this is how the founding fathers and war heroes have generally been portrayed in American culture. This is the standard. This is a given. This portrayal has been questioned in recent years and in the past several months in particular. The statues and the renderings and the artistic interpretations of these founding fathers are being questioned as they never have been before in recent years, months in particular. And that is completely against literally decades of the founding fathers and war heroes being portrayed in a particular way. And so that's part of the reason why it's so controversial, and there's quite a strong level of discomfort about it, because there are still some people who feel George Washington deserves to be portrayed this way. And then there are others who look at him and say, oh, he was a white guy, he was a slaveholder, he was a Southerner, he was a racist, and he doesn't deserve to be elevated on a white horse and shown as this great hero. And this is kind of where we are now. And I'm just mentioning this to you because I don't think there's any right answer, but I think it's very important for us to think about the portrayal of these American heroes and how it is so entrenched in our culture over the past 200 plus years. The questioning of it is relatively recent, but I think it's important to think of it all together and not just say, oh, well, George Washington was a Virginian, a slaveholder, and a racist. That could very well be true. But there have been decades and decades and decades of him being presented as this great hero and a founding father and the first president and blah, blah, blah. So think about that. This is one of my favorites. This is a 19th century painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. This is very famous and everybody knows this image. But again, there's a sense of artistic license, and there's a heroism and a victory and a kind of enthusiasm for these events. This is a very positive portrayal. These are the good guys. Okay, there's a sort of paradigm in literature, good versus evil. Joseph Campbell talks about this, the power of myth, and there are these typological characters, good guys, bad guys, throughout the history of literature. And it's very easy to assign or ascribe these ideals, the good guys, the bad guys, to historical figures, because it is such a part of our cultural consciousness. And it's not just the Western world. This is sort of a world, there are many cultures talk about, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, there's the mentor, there's the young man who needs to find his way, and all this sort of stuff. This is all part of it. And, a lot of these portrayals are perpetuating some things that may or may not be true. We don't know for sure if Betsy Ross really designed the flag. There is some evidence that she did. There is some evidence that she didn't, who knows? But the power of the myth is almost more important than the truth in some ways. Anyway, this is all a lot of sort of ethereal, abstract stuff to think about, but I'm mentioning this because I want you to think in terms of how complicated history is, how complicated it is to understand and interpret events from the past. Here's George Washington, again, the hero. What a handsome guy, Here he is. I just want you to think about this. Every time you look at a portrait of a founding father, every time you look at a statue that people want to tear down now, think about it. Think about the context and the period that produced the statue or the image and why we're questioning it now. I think it's very useful. I don't know the answer. I don't know if you do either, but thinking about it and talking about it, it's the journey, it's not the destination. All right, so I want to bring you back to maps. Here we get the sense of, this is what the United States of America looks like at its very beginning, after the defeat of the British, the American victory. The colonies have literally broken free from the mother country, the mother nation, England, and they're going to be their own nation. And so this is the perimeter of the United States. And you can see this is a map that shows, the GPS view, the exact geography of all the parts. And remember that we still have British territory in Canada. This is all French. And then, there's French and then Spanish territory here. But the map from the actual period, the map that from the 18th century that shows what the colonies look like, looks like this, and you can see that the borders are approximately the same as this blue area, but it's kind of open-ended, isn't it? And this is all sort of, you know, uncharted wilderness. We'll get more to that in a little bit later. So remember, we're talking about a brand new nation. Winning the war against the British is just the beginning. Now, how do you build a nation? What is it going to look like? And what physical forms are it going to take? We've talked a lot about the creation of this new capital city, the District of Columbia. It's very important that it's not in a state. It's very important that it's halfway between North and South. It's sort of a compromise. And remember, Jefferson and Washington, the Virginians and the surveyors are really the determining forces behind the physical forms and the physical manifestation of the capital city, as we've talked about. Remember, initially 10 square miles. And remember, the original L'Enfant plan is only this area here. It's just a tiny fraction of the original configuration for the federal city. Remember that Alexandria, Virginia, and Georgetown were both founded in 1750. They were port cities, very well-established port cities that were folded into the District of Columbia when it was created in 1791. Washington has always had this tension, the grand scheme, the great capital city, the benchmark of the new nation. And yet it takes a really long time for the architectural form to catch up with the ideal of this new nation. And I think it's so useful to look at Washington in embryo. Here it is sort of laid out. And this is a topographical map. I've got another view of this coming up in a little bit. Here's the topography of the District of Columbia. And you can see the city is kind of nestled here, but it's only laid out. It's kind of like you've dropped chalk lines on the ground, but the city isn't there yet. It takes a really long time to build it. And that is something that's very compelling. And our question for the next few sessions is this: who are the architects and designers that help us decide what the architecture of a new nation will look like? Who are they? Well, I'm going to tell you. And one of the first and one of the most important is this gentleman, Benjamin Henry Latrobe. His dates are 1764 to 1820. Remember that Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743. So Latrobe is 21 years younger than he is. But they are contemporaries. They knew each other well, and they were good friends. But they did not meet until Latrobe was a pretty well-established professional. And remember that Latrobe was not born in the British colonies. He was born in England. Whoops. So here we are. I'm showing you this map of Europe, 1700, and here is England, right here. And Latrobe was born in Leeds, which is about here on the map. Leeds in Yorkshire, and I'm showing you some 18th century engravings to give you a sense of this very typical English town, a town that had been there for centuries with, you know, a Gothic church in the middle and all of this beautiful countryside around. Latrobe's father was a minister, and his mother was actually born in the British colony of Pennsylvania. But her father came back, and remember that the colonies were British when Latrobe was born. And so his parents were British, even though his mother was born in Pennsylvania. For whatever reason, she and her family came back, and she lived in this town where she married Latrobe's father, and they had children. And so that's an important connection, because even before Latrobe even thinks about going to the British colonies, the newly formed United States, he has a direct connection because his mother was born in the British colonies. When Latrobe is 12 years old, he is sent to a Moravian school in Nietzsche, which is about here. It was a little hard for me to find a map, but remember that Germany as a nation doesn't exist until the end of the 19th century. At this period, it is a series of municipalities that are very small and relatively limited in governmental structure and influence. It's kind of the vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire, sort of higgledy-piggledy around this central map of Europe. So this map shows you the modern outline of Germany, and this is the eastern part of Germany where Latrobe is educated. And I'm showing you just some German cities. They're very sort of medieval, you know, and of course, Germany is a great center of education and learning. Remember that Germany was where the printing presses in the 15th century really got going. It was a place to send a young man to study and to really learn about all sorts of things, mathematics and engineering and literature and philosophy. Latrobe was multilingual. He was a very well-educated and formally educated man. For us, it's important that not only is he educated in Germany, and he spends 6 years there studying formally in this Moravian school, at age 18, so he's just a little bit younger than most of you, Latrobe embarks on the celebrated Grand Tour of Europe, and he travels throughout Germany, and he also visited France and Italy. So this is the typical way a gentleman architect would be educated in the 18th century. After studying extensively and studying a variety of subjects, mathematics, philosophy, political history, literature, languages, these are the sorts of things that a gentleman would study formally, and then he would embark on the Grand Tour. And I'm showing you this map. This is the map that you would have had in your pocket if you were a gentleman on the Grand Tour. And usually what happened is the gentleman, an 18th century gentleman, would start in England and then make his way across France into Germany and then end up in Italy. And the whole point of the Grand Tour is to go to historical cities, and for someone like Latrobe, who's interested in architecture, to see historic buildings in person and to study them and learn about them. And the primary objective for most gentlemen going on the Grand Tour is to study ancient Roman buildings and their reimagination and reinterpretation in the Renaissance. But remember, on the Grand Tour, you're experiencing buildings from all centuries, all over the place. So when Latrobe is traveling through Germany, he's visiting a lot of medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque churches. But usually the focus is on this sort of classical, ancient Roman Renaissance paradigm. And the whole idea is to look at these buildings and learn from them and study them. And part of that is drawing them. Latrobe was an exceptionally well-accomplished artist and draftsman, and he produced the most beautiful watercolors, some of which I will show you in just a few minutes. So these are 18th century views of Roman ruins, just to give you an idea of the sort of framework or the lens that a young man like Latrobe, who's interested in the arts and in architecture in particular, these are the sorts of things he would have seen on his extensive tour throughout Germany, France, and Italy. And remember, he also would have purchased books to take back with him. If you can't bring the building, you can bring books with the buildings illustrated in them. So this is a very important part of his education. And unlike Jefferson, who learns architecture sort of on the side almost exclusively from books, Jefferson did have a chance to come to Europe, and he spent 6 years in France. But remember, his primary duties were as an American diplomat. Latrobe's entire focus on the Grand Tour is to study architecture. So he's already been trained formally in the arts and architecture, along with all these other disciplines. And very much like Jefferson, Latrobe is a creature of the Enlightenment. The quest for knowledge, the quest to learn and understand lots of different things about lots of different subjects, and the effort to make the connections among those subjects. That's very important. In 1784, when Latrobe was 20, the age that most of you are, or so, he returned to England, and he apprenticed in the office of John Smeaton. John Smeaton is often called the father of civil engineering. He is most famous for the design of the Eddystone Lighthouse. And here is a portrait of John Smeaton in his wig. And I don't know why they're always sticking their hand in their vest here. I don't know. But the most important thing about this image is that it shows the Eddystone Lighthouse in the background of his portrait. And here is an early 19th century painting of this lighthouse that was on a very dangerous sort of isthmus off the coast of England. And John Smeaton is probably most famous because he is one of the first that perfects the composition of hydraulic lime. And hydraulic lime is the precursor to Portland cement. And the most important thing about hydraulic lime is that it can cure underwater. Wow, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, this is how 19th century and into the 20th century bridges were created. This whole notion that you can create a substance that is liquid, that will dry and be firm enough to carry incredible weight. I mean, it's sort of amazing. And we don't have time to get into that here, but this is the sort of complex engineering and this use of hydraulic lime to create forms that are locked in place. This is like the precursor to cinder blocks, actually, and it's mid 18th century technology. It's quite incredible. And John Smeaton was responsible, even though this lighthouse is probably his most famous, he was responsible for bridges and aqueducts and all sorts of great stuff. And Latrobe worked in his office. Latrobe also worked for Samuel Pepys Cockerell, a British architect, before he practices in England and he works for other architects. He gets married and has 2 children, but his wife dies in 1795, and he is heartbroken. And this is part of the reason he decides to make a fresh start, and he emigrates to the newly formed United States. The United States is a brand new nation. It is less than a decade away from the victory over the British. And so Latrobe decides to leave England and start over. And he emigrates to the United States and settles in Richmond, Virginia. Now, we've already visited Richmond. Here it is on the James River. Remember that Jefferson moved the capital of the Virginia colony, now the state of Virginia, from Williamsburg to Richmond in 1780. And here is the brand new Virginia state capitol up on this hill overlooking the James, in this city, which became it's obviously the capital of Virginia, so it's a very important city. It quickly becomes an industrial center, and it's very much in the tradition, though it's smaller than New York and Philadelphia. It does have, because of it's on the river, it does become to a certain extent an industrial center. And of course, it's a very important place at the outset of the Civil War, which we're not going to get into. But the point is that this is a bustling new community. There's lots of new construction. There's lots going on. And it's a new nation, a new city. You know, this newness and this fresh start would have really appealed to Latrobe. While he's in Richmond, he meets the nephew of George Washington, and he visits Mount Vernon, and he meets Washington. He goes to Mount Vernon and hangs out, and we know that Latrobe went to Mount Vernon because this is Latrobe's watercolor of the riverfront of Mount Vernon. It's a very beautiful rendering, and it shows this plantation house right on the Potomac River. So Latrobe spends a little time in Richmond, and he works on the Virginia Penitentiary for a few years, but he visits Philadelphia, which is a much bigger and much better established city than Richmond at this time. And he moves there in 1798. And so, of course, we've spent a lot of time in Philadelphia. Here's William Penn's famous plan here. And this is Philadelphia just spreading out and really getting its sea legs. Remember that it's been in existence for almost 100 years at this point, very well established, one of the most important cities in the United States, a thriving port, you know, lots of economic activity going on and lots of new construction. And Latrobe moves to Philadelphia because he gets a very important commission. And his first major American commission is the building I'm about to show you. This is the Bank of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. It was started in 1798. And this is Latrobe's very beautiful watercolor. Now, this building begins to give us a sense of Latrobe's architectural, I don't want to call it aesthetic, but the particular way he uses language to articulate architectural forms. He studied ancient Roman Renaissance architecture. He studied mathematics and geometry and all of these things. And he uses the classical or traditional language in a very distinctive way. And so this is what I want you to really think about. You know, I remember when I was teaching continuing education to school teachers when I was in graduate school. And the question they always asked me was, well, what style is it? Like, what style is this building? Like, we're supposed to categorize it. And remember, at the beginning of this class, I talked about how important it has been in the creation of the history of art and history of architecture to categorize things and put them in little boxes. And there's always the temptation to do that. because that allows us to kind of wrap our brains around where a building or a painting or a sculpture fits in the broad continuum. Now, that is one way to look at this material, but it's also limited, because if you say that this building is of a particular style, it suggests that it happened in a time and it can't happen again. In other words, if this is a building from the past and a style from way back when, that means that this building has nothing to teach you in your own contemporary practice. And I think that some of you who are very interested in traditional design might say, oh, wow, that's a very compelling building. There's something very beautiful about it. What's going on? And what can I learn from it? And asking what style is it is going to limit you in your ability to learn how Latrobe can teach you how to use these parts to design. So let's talk about that. We have a hexagonal portico here. We have ionic columns across the front. We can see that Latrobe, there's something about his buildings that's very taut. You know, there's sort of a spareness about them, very limited windows. And the thing that I want you to remember about Latrobe that is really distinctive and really interesting, this is not a big dome. Notice how shallow this dome is. We're going to see this over and over with Latrobe. Here's another rendering. This building is long gone, sadly, and there are very few images of it. But this is another rendering from the early 19th century, and you can see this hexagonal portico, very little ornament. It's very spare, but you can see the full ionic order around the perimeter. And of course, the shallow dome that we see in this rendering is over the main sort of public space inside the bank. So we really don't have a sense of what this building looked like on the inside. But the shallow dome as the focal point of the interior is something we're going to see in other Latrobe buildings. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go. Sadly, the Bank of Pennsylvania is no longer with us, but Latrobe's output was prolific, and there are lots of buildings that are still with us that we can visit today. And here's one of them. This is the Baltimore Cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland. And you can see that, again, there's the hexagonal portico across the front, but this is a much bigger, much more elaborate building. The Bank of Pennsylvania is relatively small. You can see it here on the right. This is a Catholic cathedral. It's a very big building, but you can see some signature Latrobe elements. These recessed windows, the demi-lune windows at the top, very spare. The full entablature extends around the perimeter, but it's pretty lean on ornament. This is not minimalist. It's just a very restrained use of this particular language. And even though this dome is a little bit higher up and has more ridges than this one, there's still a shallowness about it that is very distinctive. It's much more like the dome of the Pantheon, if you will. Now, here's the building. In fact, you can visit it. It's in great shape, which is wonderful to see. This is the very spare, restrained ionic order in the hexagonal front. This reminds me very much of some of the plates in Palladio, and it also reminds me of one of the pavilions at UVA. There is a hexagonal pavilion, and it's ionic. I think it's Pavilion 5 at UVA. So you could make some really interesting comparisons. This building predates UVA by about 10 years. But remember that Latrobe and Jefferson had met by this point. They're friends, partially because Latrobe served as architect of the Capitol when Jefferson was president, and we're in DC, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But let's stick with the Baltimore Cathedral here, this magnificent commission, still there today, and you can visit it. And again, Latrobe's beautiful watercolors give us a very good sense of his intentions. You can see that it's a longitudinal plan, and again, like the Bank of Pennsylvania, there is a dome, a relatively shallow dome, above the central transept space, and we can see that articulated in this section right here. So there are actually two domes. There's this dome, and then there's this other dome over the main transept area. And notice all of these archways in the crypt area. We're going to see this sort of detail again in buildings coming up, particularly Latrobe's design for the US Capitol. So I think that you're getting a sense of the language. When we go inside, notice how shallow this dome is. There's something very restrained and very elegant about it. And again, the ionic order is continued in the apse around the altar. And then there are these very restrained, spare ornamental panels. They're very shallow in relief. But there's a unity to the composition. It's very, very sophisticated. Notice how shallow this dome is. It doesn't go straight up. You know, it doesn't read as a sphere above your head. It reads more like a saucer. And Latrobe uses this dome over and over again in a very beautiful way. And it's interesting that this dome works at a variety of scales. The Bank of Pennsylvania is a small building. Baltimore Cathedral is quite large, and we're going to see the shallow dome at another small church coming up in just a second. This is what the dome looks like as you look up. And again, it's relatively shallow, but articulated with these coffers in plaster. And this very light colored sort of blue and yellow scheme. I think that there have been, the Baltimore Cathedral has been restored, and there's been a lot of research about original paint colors and, you know, all that stuff. And I think that this is very much this sort of late 18th, early 19th century aesthetic. It makes a lot of sense. It would be very interesting. I was thinking about doing this and I didn't have time, but I think I might do it next time. I'm going to bring in some images of the 18th century colonial churches in Boston, and some of the other places that we've looked at. It would be really fun to compare them in terms of their articulation with architectural elements, their scale, comparing it, a colonial church, a British church that is repurposed eventually as an American church. But this is a church that's built, it's a Catholic church, first of all. So that's different than all the other churches we've seen, which were various Protestant denominations. But this is much bigger. And of course, Baltimore was a very important port city in the end of the 18th, early 19th century. So this gives you a sense of scale, the people hanging out. You can see this church is a lot bigger than the colonial churches we saw in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. So very interesting stuff. And again, just notice the scale of this shallow coffered dome here. This is a Latrobe signature that we see over and over again. Pretty amazing. And it would be fun to look at Palladio and James Gibbs and some of these other treatises, which were very much the architectural kit of parts for architects from this period, and see if there are relationships, direct or indirect relationships, between those architecture books and Latrobe's work. Latrobe certainly would have had copies of these. He would have known about them. He would have studied them. He would have had them in his library, and they would have been a direct source of information and ideas for him. Again, notice how shallow these domes are. They're like saucers, but there's something really special and elegant about it's lifted just a little bit. And it actually makes the space more intimate because the dome isn't way up there. It doesn't feel like it's far away. It doesn't have the verticality of a Gothic cathedral. It doesn't have the verticality of even a dome that is more, you know, shaped like this, like the mid-19th century US Capitol dome, which is much more vertical and much more soaring. This does not soar up. It's vertical, but it's above you, but it's closer to you. So it's a very interesting thing. Now, you know how much I love maps. Something I love almost as much as maps are stamps. And if you see a building on a stamp, you know that it's important. And we're going to see all of these buildings in the next couple of weeks. We've already visited the Rotunda at the University of Virginia. Here's the Baltimore Cathedral, and we're going to see these two buildings next week. So stay tuned. I know that you are on the edge of your seats. You can hardly stand it. So we're back to the Federal City, still an embryo, still trying to find its way. We've seen the beautiful plans, and this figure ground really shows us the grand vision of the founding fathers, of Washington and Jefferson in particular. This is the topographical map of the area. And I love this because remember how we talked about how folks in the 18th century couldn't float in a balloon and they couldn't float above the land, but they were very much a part of the land. And remember that Jefferson and Washington are surveyors. And so they literally know the lay of the land, because they're standing on it and they have mathematical and surveying instruments that allow them to understand the topography. And here is the topography. And this is just incredibly interesting because it just shows you how it is before a city is built and how you have to take the topography and the land itself into account. And again, this map, I found a better image of it. It shows the L'Enfant plan nestled here at the confluence of the Potomac and the Anacostia. And there is a sense of the topography from this image, right? But it's wilderness. So Latrobe, imagine an Englishman who's been to all of these European cities. He's multilingual, he's well-educated. This is the Wild West for Latrobe. I mean, he is in the middle of nowhere. Just because it's laid out does not mean it looks like this. When Latrobe arrives in the United States and he goes to the District of Columbia, and he actually has several very important commissions in the federal city, Washington, D.C. And here is one of them. This is St. John's Church on Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. This is right across the street from the White House. And this is a commission from 1815. Again, you can see these shallow demi-lune, half moon doors and window openings, very restrained. This church was originally envisioned to be basically a cube with a very shallow dome and this lantern at the top. And I think if you compare St. John's to the Bank of Pennsylvania, you can really see the relationship and how Latrobe is using this language in a very distinctive way. This is Latrobe's very famous watercolor of St. John's next to the White House. And remember that the White House, designed by the Irishman James Hoban, constructed, but remember it burned in the fire of 1812, the War of 1812 with the British. And so Latrobe shows the White House, it's kind of a wreck here. There's a chunk missing from the west side. And, there are sheep sort of grazing out here. I mean, these two buildings are literally in the middle of nowhere. You can barely see that the streets are laid out. It's wilderness, really. And it's just amazing to think about it now. So here's St. John's, and this is the original intention. The shallow saucer-like dome intended originally to be above the main part of the church. And you can see, again, this beautiful watercolor. It became very clear quickly within a couple decades that this church was way too small. And so Latrobe adds a nave and adds this portico, and then the steeple was added later by James Renwick, who, if you take my class next semester, we will meet him. This is a rendering of what St. John's eventually, actually very within a couple decades of the original design looked like. So if you compare the original plan, here is that saucer dome. The dome still exists above the nave, but now the nave is extended, and it's a double aisle church. And this is the St. John's that we know today. I should tell you, I'm a member of St. John's. I've been a member there for 20 years. And it is a great privilege to spend so much time in this beautiful building. It's really fun to look at these 19th century views with all of these row houses around. Of course, now it's the White House is to the south, but it's surrounded by all these office buildings and the Haddams across the street. But you can see the original Latrobe configuration of this sort of cube building with the original lantern right here. And then the nave extends to the west. And the steeple by James Renwick is added after the Civil War. Inside, it was really hard for me to find pictures, but again, there's a very shallow dome that floats above, and you can see Latrobe's original. He uses these very sort of gentle arches around the initial square cube configuration. And then this part, the Palladian window here, and these columns were added by the architecture firm McKim, Mead & White in the 19-teens. And you can see, most people don't even realize, because in the early 20th century, the architects were so sensitive to Latrobe's original vision that they add this chunk of it for the altar area, but it's very much in keeping with Latrobe's early 19th century vision. This gives you a sense, this is a very intimate building. It holds about 800 people. And again, the shallow dome. I do need to, taking photographs inside is tricky, but I'll tell you, all of St. John's services are online these days, and the rector, Rob Fisher, is an excellent photographer, and he loves taking pictures of the building. So if you want to get a better sense of the building, go to Facebook and go to the St. John's webpage, and there are pictures that Rob has taken of the whole building and all these architectural details, and you can really get a sense of it, which is kind of fun. So if you're into that, it is an Episcopal church, so I hope you Catholics don't feel like you're stepping out too much, but it's worth the trip, no matter what your interest is or your faith or whatever. It's a fantastic building, and it's been in continuous use as a Christian church for 200 years, which is an amazing thing. Latrobe is a busy guy, and he also did renderings and a reimagination of the White House. Remember, the White House was destroyed it was damaged rather, during the War of 1812. And this is the view this is Latrobe's design for the South Front. Notice here's St. John's in the watercolor right here. And then this is where the Truman porch is now, the side of the White House that looks to the mall. Oops, sorry about that. This is how Latrobe envisions. You can see his use of the ionic order here. And then here's a side elevation. He's got a combination of ionic capitals with pilasters that extend all the way around the perimeter. So it extends the orders all the way around. This is a much more highly embellished. It's not quite as restrained as St. John's or the Bank of Pennsylvania. There's a lot more ornament, if you will, in the full use of the orders in the pilasters and the surrounds of the windows in particular. And here is Latrobe's plan for the White House reimagined. But again, I just want to remind you, here's the White House, and here's the Capitol, Latrobe's original design for the Capitol. And notice, it's kind of the sticks here. You know, the streets have been envisioned, but they haven't been built yet. And it really is kind of like the boonies. You know, there's very little there. And it's just incredible to think about how the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and architects like Latrobe have the vision to imagine the possibilities for creating architecture in a new nation on what is essentially virgin land. I mean, there was nothing there, nothing except the topography, and nothing except the political and cultural ideal of a new nation. We have a lot more to talk about with Latrobe and his design for the US Capitol in particular, which is very important. His design is the original, and I'll show it just really briefly here. This is Latrobe's original design, which was built. And notice again that shallow dome. We are going to talk about the US Capitol and the rest of Latrobe's career next time. So I will see you then.